She stood in the rain, watching her own clothes land in the mud, thrown from the window of the mansion that legally bore her name. Her husband didn't know. Nobody did. Not yet. Just 48 hours earlier, a $20 billion real estate empire, hotels, towers, commercial properties spanning 4 continents, had been quietly transferred into her name through a legal inheritance she hadn't even processed yet. He didn't know he had just evicted the woman who owned everything he was standing on. He didn't know the mansion he was handing to his mistress wasn't his to give. He didn't know that while he changed the locks, she was already on the phone, not crying, not begging, but pulling a document from a sealed legal envelope that would make every lawyer in that room go silent. That night, when she walked back through those doors soaking wet, carrying nothing but that single property document, the room didn't just go quiet. It froze. What was written on that document that made even his lawyers step back? What did a $20 billion inheritance actually mean for every move he'd made that night? And why did the mistress leave before morning, without a single bag? Her name was Claire Whitfield, and for 11 years, she had done everything a devoted wife was supposed to do. She had folded herself small, quiet, grateful. She had stood beside Marcus Whitfield at every ribbon-cutting ceremony, every black tie gala, every press photo where he smiled with his hand on her waist, like she was a prop he remembered to bring. She had learned to read the room before she spoke. She had learned to lower her voice when his ego needed space. She had learned, slowly, painfully, the way only women who love the wrong men learn, that in Marcus Whitfield's world, she was decoration. Useful when needed, invisible when not, and she had accepted it. That was the part that would later make her stomach turn. Not what Marcus did, but how long she had accepted. But bonhomme. They had met in Chicago 17 years ago, when Claire was 24 and finishing her graduate thesis on property law at Northwestern. Marcus had been sharp then, ambitious. He'd had the kind of hunger in his eyes that young women mistake for passion. He courted her with intensity, calls at midnight, roses left at her library desk, a weekend in New York, where he told her she was the most intelligent woman he had ever met. She had believed him. She had believed all of it. What she didn't know then, what she would spend the next 11 years of marriage slowly uncovering, was that Marcus Whitfield didn't love people. He acquired them. He had married her, not because she was brilliant, but because her grandfather, Edmund Hargrove, was one of the most quietly powerful real estate dynasties in American history. Edmund had built his empire the old way, brick by brick, deed by deed, across 40 years and 14 states. And Marcus, who had grown up watching men, like Edmund from the outside of tall glass buildings, had spotted Claire at a conference her grandfather hosted and had calculated, with surgical precision, the fastest route to a legacy he hadn't earned. Claire had never known this, or rather, she had felt it, the way women often feel things they are not yet ready to name. There were moments over the years, small, sharp moments that she had smoothed over with excuses, the way Marcus steered conversations toward her grandfather at family dinners, the way he had quietly pushed Claire to spend more time at Edmund's estate in Connecticut during the last years of the old man's life, not out of love for Edmund, but because Marcus understood proximity to wealth was proximity to inheritance, the way he had been strangely calm the morning Edmund passed 18 months ago, offering condolences with his hand already reaching for his phone. Claire had grieved alone. Marcus had grieved nothing. And then, 48 hours ago, a bank-on call had come from Hargrove and Associates legal firm, Edmund's attorneys, informing Claire that the reading of the final amended will had been completed, and that she, Claire Ann Whitfield, née Hargrove, was the sole heir to the Hargrove Real Estate Trust. All of it. $20 billion in assessed property value. Towers, hotels, commercial portfolios, residential developments, the Connecticut estate, the Manhattan headquarters, the Whitfield mansion itself, the one Marcus had moved them into 6 years ago and spent years convincing Claire he had purchased with his own business dealings. He hadn't purchased it. Edmund had owned it all along. And now Claire did. She hadn't told Marcus yet. She had barely told herself. The sealed legal envelope was still sitting on the passenger seat of her car when she arrived home that Friday evening, jet-lagged from a legal meeting in New York, still processing numbers that didn't feel real, and walked through the front gates of her own home to find her clothes flying through the rain, to find Tara Sinclair standing in the doorway of Claire's bedroom, wearing Claire's silk robe, holding a glass of Claire's wine, watching with a slow smile as Marcus hurled the last of Claire's belongings into the wet gravel below. "She's not coming back," Marcus said to no one in particular, not even looking down at Claire standing in the driveway. "This is Tara's house now." He still didn't know. He was standing in a house that belonged to the woman he was trying to destroy, and the document in her car was about to make sure he never forgot it. The rain had soaked through Claire's coat by the time she reached the bottom of the driveway. She didn't move, not immediately. She stood there, completely still, in the kind of silence that only comes after the mind has absorbed something so grotesque that it temporarily refuses to process it. Her cream-colored coat was turning translucent against her shoulders. Her heels had sunk slightly into the soft, wet gravel. A cashmere sweater she had owned since graduate school was draped across a rose bush to her left, soaking. A framed photograph of her and her grandfather at his Connecticut estate lay face up on the ground 3 feet away, Edmund's face slowly blurring behind a sheet of rainwater collecting on the glass. She stared at that photograph for a long moment. Edmund Hargrove had warned her, not in the way that people warn each other in arguments, loudly, desperately, with urgency. Edmund had warned her the way old men who have watched the world long enough tend to warn the people they love most, quietly, precisely, and only once. It had been 7 years ago, at Thanksgiving dinner in Connecticut. Marcus had excused himself from the table to take a call, and Edmund had set down his fork, looked at Claire across the long mahogany table, and said simply, "A man who wants what you carry will always pretend to want you first. And watch a boy, what he reaches for when he thinks you aren't looking." Claire had laughed softly and told him he was being old-fashioned. Edmund had not laughed back. He had simply picked his fork back up and said nothing more, the way men say everything by saying nothing. And that silence had lived somewhere in the back of Claire's chest for 7 years, like a splinter she could never quite reach. She was reaching it now. She pulled her eyes away from her grandfather's photograph, straightened her spine, something she did instinctively, the way women who have been humiliated in public teach themselves to do. And she turned toward the car parked at the edge of the driveway, her silver Mercedes, the one she had driven back from New York that afternoon, the one with the sealed legal envelope still sitting on the passenger seat, exactly where she had left it. She walked to it, opened the door, reached inside. The envelope was thick, cream-colored, heavyweight paper, embossed with the Hargrove and Associates seal in the upper left corner. She had been afraid to open it on the drive back, not because she didn't understand what it contained. The attorneys had already walked her through everything on the call, but because she understood it too well. Because the moment she broke that seal, something in her life that had been quietly shifting for 18 months would become irreversible, official, and real. She broke it now. She didn't read it in the driveway. She didn't need to. She had read it twice already in the attorney's Manhattan office. She knew every page, every clause, every legally binding sentence, that turned the ground beneath Marcus Whitfield's feet into something that no longer belonged to him, if it ever had. She simply held it, felt the weight of it in her hands. Let the rain hit the top page for exactly 3 seconds before she tucked it beneath her coat, pressed it flat against her chest, and turned toward the front door of the mansion. Her mansion. The door was still open. Marcus hadn't bothered to close it. Why would he? He thought he had already won. That was the particular cruelty of men like Marcus Whitfield. They didn't just want to defeat you. They wanted you to watch them celebrate while doing it. He had thrown her clothes into the rain and left the door open because he wanted her to see Tara in that doorway. He wanted Claire to understand, visually and completely, that she had been replaced. Not quietly, not privately, but publicly, theatrically, in the driveway of a home he had spent years letting her believe was his gift to her. Claire walked through the front door. The foyer was warm. Chandelier light caught the marble floors and threw soft gold across the walls. She could hear voices, Marcus's low laughter from the sitting room to the left, and Tara's higher, looser voice, responding with the particular ease of a woman who had been in this house many times before Claire was supposed to know about it. That registered somewhere deep and cold in Claire's chest. The ease of it. This wasn't a woman who had just arrived. This was a woman who knew where the wine glasses were kept without opening the wrong cabinet. A woman who had walked these halls enough times to feel at home in them. Marcus heard the footsteps first. He appeared in the doorway of the sitting room with a glass of scotch in his hand. Claire's grandfather's scotch, from Edmund's private collection, that Marcus had always helped himself to without asking. And he looked at Claire, the way men who have rehearsed their cruelty look at their victims, prepared, almost bored. "I told them not to let you in," he said, swirling the glass slowly. "The new security code is already changed." Claire said nothing. She was looking at him, really looking at him, perhaps for the first time in years. Not with the filtered vision of a woman who has spent a decade explaining a man's behavior to herself. But clearly, completely, the way you look at something once you have finally stopped lying about what it is. Marcus mistook her silence for devastation. He always had. Silence from Claire had always meant she was managing herself, pulling inward, suppressing, recalibrating. He had spent 11 years training her into that silence, and he had grown comfortable inside it, the way predators grow comfortable in the spaces they have hollowed out. He smiled slightly, that slow, sideways smile she had once found charming, and he said, "You should go, Claire. There's nothing here for you anymore." Tara appeared behind him in the doorway. She was still wearing Claire's robe. She leaned against the doorframe with the particular posture of a woman performing confidence rather than possessing it. One hip slightly forward, the wine glass held loosely, her eyes moving over Claire with the slow measurement of someone who has been waiting for this confrontation and has decided she has already won it. "She's dripping on the floor," Tara said, looking at Claire's wet coat with a small, dismissive smile. Claire looked down at the marble floor beneath her feet. Then she looked back up, and she pulled the document from beneath her coat. The top page was barely damp at the edges. She had held it close enough to her chest to protect it from the rain, which, later, people would say felt symbolic. Like she had known, even then, exactly what she was carrying. She held it at her side, didn't wave it, didn't announce it, didn't perform anything. She simply held it with the quiet certainty of a woman who has just remembered who she is. "I'm not here to argue," Claire said. Her voice was low and completely steady. "I'm here because I need you both to understand something before tomorrow morning." Marcus exhaled through his nose, the specific exhale of a man who has decided this is theater. "Claire." "This house," she said, is listed as asset number 1 in the file wife, Hargrove Real Estate Trust. She turned the first page. It was purchased by my grandfather, Edmund James Hargrove, in 2003. It has never, not once, been transferred into your name. The smile on Marcus's face did not disappear immediately. It faded, slowly, the way color drains from something that has just been cut off from its source. His eyes moved to the document, then back to her face, then to the document again. It is currently, as of 48 hours ago, Claire continued, the legal property of Claire Ann Whitfield, née Hargrove. She looked at Tara, which means the woman standing in my foyer, wearing my robe, holding my wine, is a trespasser. The sitting room behind them was no longer making noise. Somewhere during Claire's words, the 2 associates Marcus had been entertaining earlier had gone completely silent. A glass was set down on a surface. Someone shifted their weight. And then, nothing. The specific nothing of people who have just realized. They are standing inside a situation that is much larger and much more serious than the room they thought they had walked into. Marcus opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again, and the document in Claire's hand didn't move, didn't waver, didn't shake with the trembling of a woman who was afraid. It stayed exactly where she held it, firm and dry against her fingers, while the rain continued behind her, and the chandelier light continued above her, and the marble floor her grandfather had chosen, the one Marcus had always taken credit for, reflected the image of a woman who had just remembered that she owned every inch of the ground she was standing on. The room didn't just go quiet. It froze. The freeze lasted exactly 4 seconds. Claire counted them, not deliberately, but the way the mind counts things when it has slowed itself down to absolute precision, cataloging every detail of a moment it knows will matter later. 4 seconds of complete, crystalline silence in which the chandelier hummed above them, the rain tapped against the tall windows, and Marcus Whitfield stood in the doorway of a sitting room he did not own, holding a glass of scotch that had never belonged to him, watching his entire architecture begin to crack at the foundation. Then he laughed. It was not the laugh of a man who found something funny. It was the laugh of a man reaching for a weapon he had always kept loaded for exactly this kind of moment. The laugh that was designed to make the person across from him feel small, hysterical, and confused about what they had just said. Claire had heard it 100 times across 11 years of marriage. She had heard it when she raised concerns about his business partners. She had heard it when she asked about unexplained withdrawals from their joint account. She had heard it the one time, 3 years ago, over dinner, when she had quietly said she felt lonely in their marriage, and he had laughed then too, softly, shaking his head like she was a child misreading a story. He had always used laughter as a door, a way of closing off any room she tried to open. Claire. He said her name the way he always did when he was managing her, gently, slowly, with a slight downward tilt of the chin that suggested patience being extended to someone who didn't deserve it. He set the scotch glass down on the foyer side table. Edmund's side table, Claire noticed, the one from the Connecticut estate that Marcus had quietly moved here 6 years ago without mentioning it, and he folded his arms across his chest. You're soaking wet and you're upset. That's completely understandable. Marcus, let me finish. His voice was still calm, controlled. You've just come from a legal meeting. You're emotional. Someone has fed you information that you clearly haven't had time to fully process. He gestured toward the document in her hands with a loose, dismissive wave, the gesture of a man indicating a piece of paper he was not remotely threatened by. And I understand why you'd want to come in here and make a scene. I do, but this isn't the way to handle it. He was doing it. Right now. In front of witnesses. He was taking the most legitimate, legally documented thing Claire had ever held in her hands and repackaging it as a symptom of her emotional instability. He was doing it smoothly, fluently, without a single stumble, which told Claire something that landed in her chest like a stone dropped into still water. He had practiced this. Not this exact conversation, perhaps, but this dynamic. The mechanism of it. The architecture of making her doubt the ground beneath her own feet had been built and reinforced across 11 years of calculated, patient, surgical erosion. Tara said nothing now. She had stepped back slightly from the doorway, not out of shame, Claire noticed, but out of the specific, tactical withdrawal of someone who has been coached to let Marcus handle the talking in situations like this. That detail landed too. Coached. This had been planned. Before Claire could respond, a voice came from the far end of the foyer. "Marcus, I got here as fast as I could." Claire turned. Standing in the doorway, still shaking rain from his overcoat, briefcase in hand, slightly out of breath, was Daniel Mercer. Claire's personal attorney, not Marcus's. Hers. The man she had called 3 months ago when she first received the preliminary notice from Hargrove and Associates. The man she had trusted with the early details of the inheritance before it was finalized. The man she had specifically asked to keep the matter completely confidential until she was ready to proceed. He wasn't looking at Claire. He was looking at Marcus. And Marcus, for just a fraction of a second, before he reassembled his expression into something neutral, looked relieved. The stone in Claire's chest became something heavier. Something that had no name yet, but would have one by morning. Daniel finally turned to her. His face arranged itself into something that resembled professional sympathy, but his eyes didn't match. His eyes had the particular quality of a man who has already decided which side of a room he is standing on and has simply not yet announced it. "Claire," he said carefully, "I think we should all sit down." "Daniel." Her voice was very quiet. "Why are you here?" "Marcus contacted me this afternoon. There are some things about the trust documentation that need to be discussed before you." "He contacted you," Claire repeated. Not a question, a recalibration. 3 months ago, she had sat in Daniel Mercer's office on Michigan Avenue and told him, explicitly, specifically, in the kind of clear language she had learned from years of studying property law herself, that her husband was not to know about the inheritance until she had decided how to proceed. Daniel had nodded, had assured her, had billed her $400 an hour for the privilege of that assurance. And Marcus had called him this afternoon, which meant Daniel had told Marcus something. Not everything. Marcus's reaction to the document had been too genuine, too unguarded, for him to have known the full scope of what she was holding. But something. Enough for Marcus to have made a call. Enough for Daniel to have driven here in the rain with his briefcase and his rehearsed expression. She had been betrayed before she had even walked through the door. The room felt different now. The gold light from the chandelier that had seemed almost cinematic moments ago now felt too warm, too close. The kind of warmth that precedes suffocation rather than comfort. The 2 associates in the sitting room had reappeared in the doorway, she noticed. Not subtly. They were watching openly now, the way people watch when they believe the outcome has already been decided, and they are simply waiting for the losing party to understand it. Marcus unfolded his arms. He crossed the foyer toward her with the slow, deliberate pace of a man reclaiming territory, and he stopped close enough that she could smell Edmund's scotch on his breath, which was its own specific kind of cruelty. And he lowered his voice to the register he used when he wanted a conversation to feel private, even when it wasn't. "I know about the trust, Claire," he said quietly. "Daniel briefed me. Not everything. I can see that. But enough." He glanced at the document. Enough to know that before you do anything with whatever is in that envelope, you need to understand something. He paused, letting the pause do the work. Pauses do between people with a long history. I am not leaving this house. Claire held his gaze. And here is why, he continued. And now his voice dropped further, almost gentle, in the horrifying way that the most dangerous version of Marcus had always been gentle. 3 weeks ago, I filed paperwork with the Cook County Recorder of Deeds. A spousal property interest claim, marital contribution, 11 years of documented cohabitation, joint financial investment. He tilted his head slightly. My attorney, my real attorney, not Daniel, filed it while you were in New York. The ghost of that slow smile returned, which means whatever that document says, whatever your grandfather left you, this house is currently the subject of an active legal claim, and until that claim is resolved, he took one step back, gestured broadly at the foyer around them. Nobody's going anywhere. The associates in the doorway exchanged a glance. Tara exhaled, a small, quiet exhale of relief that she clearly didn't intend to be audible, but was. And Daniel Mercer stood near the door with his briefcase and said absolutely nothing, which was, of all the things that had happened in the last 4 minutes, the loudest thing in the room. Claire did not move, did not speak, did not give Marcus the satisfaction of watching her absorb this information visibly, did not let her eyes widen or her jaw shift or her fingers tighten around the document in a way that would tell him the blow had landed. But it had landed, because what Marcus had just described, a spousal interest claim filed 3 weeks ago while she was traveling, before the trust had even been formally transferred, was not impulsive. It was not reactive. It was premeditated. It was the move of a man who had known something was coming long before Claire had been told anything was coming, which meant someone had told him. Someone inside Hargrove and Associates had leaked the preliminary trust transfer to Marcus Whitfield before the attorneys had even called Claire, before she had sat in that Manhattan office, before she had driven home with the envelope on her passenger seat. Marcus had known. He had known, and he had spent 3 weeks preparing. He had filed legal paperwork. He had turned her own attorney. He had moved his mistress into the house. He had thrown Claire's clothes into the rain, not in a rage, but on a schedule. All of it. Every piece of it. Choreographed. Claire stood in the marble foyer of her grandfather's house, soaking wet, betrayed by her attorney, outmaneuvered by her husband, surrounded by his witnesses, and she felt, for the first time since she had broken that envelope's seal, the specific and terrible sensation of ground shifting beneath her feet. She looked down at the document in her hands. Then she looked up, and something moved across her face. Not defeat, and not anger, and not grief, but something older and quieter than all three of those things combined. Something that looked, to everyone in that room, very much like a woman who had just lost. She had not lost, but she would let them believe she had, for exactly the length of time she needed, because Claire Whitfield had studied property law at Northwestern, because she had spent 11 years watching, listening, and learning the precise mechanics of how Marcus Whitfield operated, because she had a grandfather who built a $20 billion empire from nothing and who had taught her, across 35 years of quiet Sunday afternoons in his Connecticut study, that the most dangerous move a person can make is to show their opponent every card they're holding. She hadn't shown a single card yet. The document in her hand was not her strongest one. It was not even close. Claire did not make her first call in the foyer. She made it in the hallway just off the east wing, the narrow corridor lined with framed architectural blueprints of every Hargrove property ever built, which Marcus had always walked past, without looking at, because he had never been interested in the history of things, only in their current market value. She stood beneath the blueprint of this very mansion, drafted in 1987 by her grandfather's personal architect, stamped with Edmund Hargrove's signature in the lower right corner, and she dialed from memory. The phone rang twice. Claire. The voice on the other end was alert, unhurried, and carried the particular authority of a man who had been expecting this call for some time. Raymond Castillo, senior partner at Castillo and Fitch, one of the 3 most respected real estate litigation firms in the country, and the man Edmund Hargrove had personally retained 14 months ago, 2 months before his death, with a bifo, specific and detailed brief that his granddaughter might one day need someone in her corner who had not been compromised. Edmund had known. Even from his deathbed, Edmund James Hargrove had seen Marcus Whitfield clearly, and he had quietly built his granddaughter an exit she didn't yet know she needed. "It's time," Claire said. "I know," Raymond said. "We've been watching the Cook County filing since it went in 3 weeks ago. We were waiting for you." A pause, brief, purposeful. "Claire, I need you to know something before we begin. The person who leaked the preliminary trust transfer to Marcus, we identified them 6 days ago." Claire closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. "Who?" Raymond said a name, and the blueprint of the mansion blurred slightly in front of Claire's eyes. Not because she was crying, but because the name Raymond said wasn't Daniel Mercer. It was not a Hargrove and Associates paralegal. It was not a junior attorney or a records clerk or anyone Claire could have comfortably assigned her betrayal to and then set aside. The name Raymond Castillo said was Patricia Hargrove, Claire's aunt, Edmund's youngest daughter. The woman who had sat beside Claire at the funeral, held her hand during the burial, wept into a handkerchief monogrammed with Edmund's initials, and who had, 4 days after that funeral, quietly passed a single document to Marcus Whitfield over lunch at a private club in Lincoln Park, in exchange for a financial arrangement that Raymond's team had spent 6 days documenting with the kind of meticulous, irrefutable evidence that does not leave rooms for explanations. Patricia had sold her niece's inheritance to her niece's husband for $4 million, and a promise that Claire would be removed cleanly, quietly, and without a prolonged legal battle that might unearth other financial arrangements Patricia had made over the years. Arrangements involving Hargrove estate funds that Edmund had never authorized. The betrayal didn't arrive with fanfare. It arrived the way the deepest ones always do, quietly, from the direction you never thought to guard. Claire steadied herself against the wall, let her fingers rest flat against the cool plaster, breathed once, completely, from the bottom of her lungs, the way her grandfather had taught her to breathe before difficult decisions. Then she said, "Proceed with everything." Raymond proceeded. What happened next occurred across 47 minutes, and it happened with the specific, unstoppable momentum of something that had been engineered long before tonight, by a dead man who had loved his granddaughter enough to build her a fortress before she knew she was under siege. The first thing that happened was a call to the Cook County Recorder of Deeds from Raymond Castillo's office, flagging Marcus's spousal interest claim for immediate review on the basis of fraudulent predication, supported by 14 months of documented evidence that Marcus Whitfield had never made a single verifiable financial contribution to the property, that all maintenance, tax, and improvement costs had been drawn directly from Hargrove trust accounts Marcus had no legal standing to claim association with, and that the claim had been filed using falsified cohabitation financial records prepared by an accountant whose license had lapsed 18 months prior. The claim didn't just fail, it collapsed. And in collapsing, it triggered an automatic fraud review flag that would, by morning, be sitting on the desk of a Cook County prosecutor who had been quietly building a separate case against Marcus Whitfield for 22 months. Claire did not know about that case yet. She would. The second thing that happened was that Raymond's associate, a sharp, unhurried woman named Felicia Grant, walked through the front door of the mansion at 9:47 p.m., carrying a manila folder and the specific expression of someone who has delivered difficult legal news enough times to have stopped apologizing for it. She walked past Marcus, past Tara, who had changed out of Claire's robe sometime in the last 40 minutes, and was now sitting on the edge of the sitting room sofa in her own clothes, with her arms crossed and her wine glass empty, the performance of confidence having quietly dissolved into something that looked much more like the face of a woman calculating exit options. Past Daniel Mercer, who had not left, who had stayed, standing near the foyer wall with his briefcase at his feet and his phone face down in his hand, in the posture of a man who has realized too late that he bet on the wrong outcome. Felicia Grant stopped in front of Claire, opened the folder, and placed the first document on the foyer table. "Eviction order, asset number 1, she said simply. "Effective immediately. All non-title holding occupants are required to vacate the premises within the hour. Private. Security will assist with the transition." As if they had been waiting for exactly those words, because they had been, 2 men appeared in the open front doorway. Large, unhurried, wearing dark jackets with a small emblem on the chest that Marcus Whitfield did not immediately recognize, but that Daniel Mercer recognized immediately, because the emblem belonged to the security firm retained exclusively by Castillo and Fitch for exactly this kind of property recovery. Daniel picked up his briefcase. He was the first one to move toward the door. No words, no eye contact. Just the quiet, rapid departure of a man who understood precisely what was about to be filed against him before sunrise. The bar complaint, the malpractice suit, the breach of fiduciary duty claim that Raymond's team had been building since the moment they identified the leak, and who had calculated correctly that there was nothing left to say inside this room that would help him. He was wrong about that. There was nothing left to say anywhere that would help him. He was wrong about that. There was nothing left to say anywhere that would help him. Marcus did not move immediately. He stood in the center of the foyer, his house, his life, his empire. And he looked at Claire with an expression she had never seen on his face before in 17 years of knowing him. Not anger, not calculation, not the managed, rehearsed composure he wore like a second skin. He looked, for the first time, like a man who did not know what to do next. Claire. His voice had lost its register. The careful, controlled baritone he had wielded for years had shed itself, and what was underneath it was something rawer and smaller, something that might, in another story with a different woman, have produced mercy. "Everything I built, everything we had." "You didn't build anything, Marcus," Claire said. She said it without heat, without the satisfaction he might have expected, or perhaps deserved. She said it with the flat, factual clarity of a woman reading from a record she had finally stopped disputing. "You built a life on my grandfather's land, with my grandfather's money, using my grandfather's name, and you spent 11 years making me believe it was yours." She looked at him completely. "I believed you. That's on me. What you did with my belief, that's on you." Marcus opened his mouth. He closed it, because there was nothing to say to the truth when it had been documented across 14 months of legal preparation by a man who had seen you clearly from the beginning and had loved his granddaughter enough to make sure that when the day came, she would not be standing in the rain without ground beneath her feet. She was not standing in the rain anymore. She was standing on ground that had always been hers. Tara Sinclair left without speaking. She walked past Claire without looking at her, the specific non-look of a woman who has understood that the man she destroyed her own integrity for had nothing to offer her that was ever actually his to give. She had one hand on the front door when Claire said, quietly, not to wound, but because it was true, and because Tara deserved to carry it. He told you this house was his. Tara's hand stilled on the door. He told me the same thing, Claire said. For 6 years. Tara did not turn around, but her shoulders changed, a barely perceptible shift that held, compressed inside it, the full weight of a woman who has just understood that she was not the weapon in this story. She was also the victim of it. The door closed behind her. By 11 p.m., the foyer was empty except for Claire and Felicia Grant, and the 2 security personnel standing at a respectful distance near the entrance. Marcus had been escorted out at 10:23, not loudly, not in handcuffs, not with the dramatic collapse Claire might have once imagined in her darkest moments of fantasy. He had walked out quietly, in his shirt sleeves, without his phone, which had been held as material evidence per a court order Claire had not yet told him about, and without the scotch glass, and without any of the 17 things in that house that he had spent years calling his. He walked out into the rain, and Claire stood in the marble foyer and watched the door close behind him and felt, not triumph, not relief, not the cathartic flood of emotion that people imagine accompanies moments like this. She felt still, the particular stillness of a woman who has survived something enormous and is only now, in the quiet after it, beginning to understand how deep the damage goes. The stillness of someone standing at the beginning of something rather than the end of it. Felicia closed the folder. Raymond wants a full briefing at 8 a.m. There are 6 remaining asset recovery orders to process. And the Cook County matter. Felicia! Claire turned to face her. What Cook County matter? Felicia paused. A pause just long enough to carry weight. Raymond didn't tell you. No. Felicia looked at her with the careful expression of someone choosing how much to open a door rather than whether to open it. Claire, the fraud review flagged that Marcus's spousal claim triggered tonight. It didn't initiate a new investigation. She paused again. It connected to an existing one. Claire felt the stillness in her shift. How long? 22 months. 22 months. Before Edmund died. Before the inheritance. Before any of this. What is it about? Claire asked. Felicia closed the folder completely, set it flat on the foyer table, placed her hand on top of it. Marcus Whitfield has not been the primary subject of that investigation, she said carefully. Claire stared at her. There is someone else, Felicia said. Someone who has been using the Hargrove Trust properties, specifically the commercial portfolio, as collateral for a series of financial instruments that do not appear in any Hargrove legal record. She met Claire's eyes. Someone who has been doing it for 9 years. 9 years. Claire's mind moved backward, fast, precise, the way it moved when it was working. 9 years ago. She and Marcus had been married for 2 years. Edmund had still been fully active. The trust had still been entirely under Edmund's management. Who? Claire asked. Felicia held her gaze for a long moment, and then she said, The investigation has one primary subject, Claire. The name on every document. A breath. It's yours. The chandelier hummed above them. The rain continued against the tall windows. And Claire Whitfield stood in the marble foyer of her grandfather's mansion, the inheritance recovered, the husband removed, the ground reclaimed beneath her feet, and felt something cold and enormous and entirely new, begin to move beneath the surface of everything she thought she had just won. Her name on documents she had never signed. For 9 years. Someone had been building a crime inside her grandfather's empire, and they had built it wearing her name like a mask. And somewhere outside in the rain-soaked night, Marcus Whitfield was walking to a car that was not being driven by a hired car service. It was being driven by someone Claire recognized. Someone she had trusted completely. Someone who had been in the room for every critical conversation of the last 18 months. Not as a threat, not as an enemy, but as the one person Claire had never once thought to look at twice. The car pulled away from the curb, and Claire watched its tail lights disappear into the dark, and understood, with the slow and terrible clarity of someone who has just solved one puzzle only to find it sitting inside a larger one, that tonight had not been the end of what Marcus Whitfield had built against her. It had been the distraction. The ground beneath the ground had always been the real battlefield, and Claire Whitfield had just discovered she was standing on it, alone, with her name on documents she never signed, and the only person who knew the truth disappearing into the rain. Part 2 is where the real war begins. What would you have done better if you were Claire Whitfield? Let us know in the comment section. Also comment Part 2 if you want us to drop the Part 2 now.